It was one of those moments you don't forget, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was so absurd it fried my brain circuits for a full 30 seconds. I was standing on my porch, sipping my morning coffee, when I saw Karen, our HOA president, confidently walking across my yard like she owned it. Not behind the fence. Not on the sidewalk. Straight through my garden beds. She had 2 guys with her, both wheeling hand trucks toward the side of my shed. I didn't even register what was happening until I saw what they were hauling off. My woodpile. My hickory woodpile. The same one I'd spent 2 winters chopping, stacking, covering, seasoning, and babying through storms. They were loading it into her golf cart trailer like it was bulk trash. And the cherry on top? She waved at me like she was borrowing a cup of sugar. "Thanks for the donation," she said. Just like that. Like I was part of a community bake sale and had offered her the last cupcake. It took me a few seconds to process it. I even looked around, half expecting a camera crew to jump out of a bush and tell me I'd been pranked. But no. This was real. Karen had helped herself to my woodpile and was now driving it away, cackling with delight as if she'd just scored clearance patio furniture from a yard sale. I followed her, still barefoot, still in my robe, right up to her freshly decorated backyard where several folding chairs and tiki torches were already staged like a discount resort in Florida. She saw me coming and didn't even blink. "Hi. I was going to leave a note," she said, nodding at the logs being stacked by her helpers. "It's for the HOA bonfire. Don't worry, it's going to a good cause." I tried to find the words. I really did. But my mouth just opened and closed like I'd swallowed a bad shrimp. "Karen," I finally said, "that's my private woodpile. On my property. That I chopped and seasoned. For my fireplace. You can't just take it." "Oh, relax," she said, with the flippant confidence of someone who's never been told no in her entire life. "It was violating community harmony anyway. You're not even allowed to have a pile that high in view. HOA Code Section 7. Plus, this way we don't have to use HOA funds. I'm saving everyone money." She clapped once, proud of herself, like she'd just won a humanitarian award. I was stunned. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was theft, dressed up in a blazer and pearls. She turned back to her workers. "Stack the rest near the gazebo. We'll light it up tonight for the community marshmallow roast." I told the caterers we'd go full rustic this time. That was the moment I realized she wasn't just stealing. She was bragging about it, using my wood as a prop in her HOA re-election campaign. She thought she was untouchable. Later that day, I sat in my living room fuming, watching from the window as Karen's backyard transformed into a Pinterest-themed party zone. String lights, hay bales, cornhole boards. The works. The worst part? Neighbors were actually showing up. They laughed. They toasted. They even complimented the authentic hickory scent. I nearly bit through my mug. I called the HOA hotline, filed a theft report, even rang up the non-emergency police line. But they all gave the same limp response. "It's a civil matter," they said. "You'll have to work it out with the board." That's when I remembered Frank. Good ol' Frank, my fishing buddy and pest control savant. Years ago, I helped him out of a serious bind with an out-of-control beehive infestation that nearly ruined his small business. He told me then, "Anything you ever need, bugs, birds, bees, I'm your guy." So I called him. Not with a scream. Not with rage. Just with that eerie calm that settles over you when you know you're about to make peace with chaos. Frank was thrilled. "You want the premium stuff?" he asked, laughing on the other end. "Drywood termites. No smell, no mess. They dig in quietly and hollow it from the inside. Won't touch humans, but give them a week and they'll treat that backyard like an all-you-can-eat buffet." I didn't need a war. I didn't even want revenge. I just wanted her to feel the weight of consequences, a rare experience for someone like Karen, who bulldozed through life like the rules were made for other people. The plan came together beautifully. I spent 2 days pretending to forgive her. "You know what, Karen, I told her at the mailbox, you were right. That woodpile was an eyesore. If you still need firewood for future events, let me know. I can contribute. She narrowed her eyes, skeptical, but the smugness eventually crept back. Well, maybe you're learning how to be a team player after all, she said. We do have another mixer coming up. Something tasteful this time, wine and firelight. Perfect. That's when I made the call. Frank delivered a. The next morning began like any other, except for the quiet satisfaction pulsing through my veins as I watched Karen's backyard from a distance. The pile of termite-infested logs I had delivered now sat stacked like a crown jewel near her pristine pergola. Sunlight poured down on the wood, drying it further, baking it just enough to make it irresistible to the colony living inside. I couldn't see the termites, of course. They were stealthy little soldiers, but I imagined them waking up, stretching their tiny legs, and realizing they'd just been dropped into an all-you-can-eat hardwood buffet. Karen had no clue that beneath her feet, the foundations of her backyard kingdom were already being chewed to pieces. Later that day, I ran into her while checking my mail. She was positively glowing. Apparently, her party had been a huge success, and she had already scheduled the next HOA mixer for the following weekend. She said it would have real class this time, outdoor wine tasting, fairy lights, and maybe a jazz quartet if her cousin's band was available. I just nodded along, letting her talk. She even thanked me again for the firewood. Didn't think you had it in you, she said. You know, real community-minded spirit. I might just mention that in the next HOA newsletter. The irony nearly made me choke on my own tongue, but I kept my poker face. Glad I could help, I said. Let me know if you need more. By the end of the week, the first signs of destruction started to show. Her backyard gate had always creaked a little, but now it sagged heavily on its hinges, and one of the posts looked like it was starting to crumble from the base. Her husband was out there one morning with a power drill, trying to reinforce it with metal brackets. I walked by and waved, trying not to laugh when he nodded at me and muttered something about cheap lumber. I knew it wasn't the wood, it was what was in the wood. And soon, it wouldn't just be one post. The next few days were bliss. Every time I stepped outside, it was like watching a time-lapse of karma in action. One afternoon, Karen's white pergola, a gaudy structure she bragged about during every HOA meeting, had a strange tilt to it. She didn't notice at first. Her attention was focused on decorating it for the upcoming event, hanging silk ribbons and solar lanterns from the beams. I spotted one corner post that had a fine dust around its base. Termite droppings. The giveaway. If I'd told her, maybe she could have saved it. But I didn't. I figured it was only fair she learned the value of not stealing from her neighbors. By the time the evening party rolled around, things were getting interesting. I wasn't invited, obviously, but I could hear everything from my yard. Laughter, clinking glasses, jazz music humming from a Bluetooth speaker. Then came the first crash. It was sharp, sudden, and followed by a shriek. I walked to the edge of my property and peeked through the hedge. One of the chairs had collapsed under the weight of a guest, who now sat in a pile of splinters and spilled Chardonnay. People rushed over, and Karen started fussing, blaming the chair manufacturer for faulty screws. What she didn't realize, at least not yet, was that the legs had been hollowed out from the inside. Not by rot. By mandibles. The next blow came minutes later when one of her decorative wooden barrels, filled with ice and wine bottles, gave out completely. The bottom split open like a dropped egg, flooding the patio and soaking Karen's fancy tablecloth. Another scream. Another round of chaos. Her husband started cursing under his breath, looking more frantic now. Guests began whispering. Some left early. Others tried to act like nothing was wrong. But I could feel the shift. The illusion of control was cracking. And Karen? She was running out of glue to hold it together. The morning after was the real spectacle. Karen called an emergency meeting of the HOA board. I wasn't on the board, but I showed up anyway because she announced it as an open session. Apparently, she intended to file a formal complaint against the chair company, the contractor who built the pergola, and possibly the delivery service that had dropped off the wine barrel. She was waving documents in the air, pacing back and forth in her sun hat, trying to regain her queen bee energy. But the board members didn't look impressed. They looked tired. One of them, Janet from Elm Street, finally interrupted her. "Karen," she said calmly, "this is the third structural failure in your yard this week. Maybe it's not the vendors. Maybe it's the wood." That set Karen off. She launched into a tirade about HOA standards, about neighbors not doing their part, about mysterious pests and sabotage. Her voice rose in pitch with every sentence. At one point, she even pointed in my direction, though she didn't say my name. "Some people," she hissed, "pretend to help when they're really just trying to humiliate you." I raised an eyebrow but didn't say a word. That's when the termites made their biggest appearance yet. One of the board members leaned over during the meeting and whispered something to Karen. She turned pale. Her eyes darted to the edge of her pergola where, even from a distance, you could now see tiny white bugs crawling across the surface in broad daylight. It was too late. The colony had multiplied. The damage was done. The pergola was visibly warped, one beam bowing slightly under the weight of the crossplanks. Karen stood up and walked over to it, examining it closely, then recoiled in disgust. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone pulled out their phone and started recording. "They're termites," someone said. "You've got termites." Karen spun around, looking for someone to blame, but her voice cracked. "I don't have termites," she snapped, as if saying it would make them disappear. "They came from, someone else brought them." Another glance at me, like she was about to scream my name and start a witch trial. But she hesitated. Because to admit she'd accepted infested firewood would mean admitting she'd taken it from me in the first place. The board wrapped the meeting quickly after that. One of the members suggested she bring in pest control immediately. Karen tried to save face, said she had already scheduled an inspection. It was a lie, of course. She was flailing. And I was enjoying every second of it without lifting a finger. That's the beauty of letting karma run its course. You don't have to force the fall, just remove the safety net and let nature do the rest. And in this case, nature had 6 legs, sharp teeth, and a hunger for hickory. Karen's downfall didn't come crashing down in a single explosive moment. It was more like a slow-motion landslide, and by the end of the week, everyone in the neighborhood had front-row seats to the chaos. The morning after the unicorn-themed birthday fiasco, half the neighborhood woke up to HOA flyers that had been shoved into their mailboxes overnight. This time they weren't about community events or updated lawn height regulations. They were a frantic screed from Karen herself, blaming her structural failures on an anonymous saboteur with a grudge against community values. The document was littered with half-baked accusations, dramatic language about targeted harassment, and a vague threat to pursue legal action against the individual responsible once identified. It didn't name anyone, but she didn't have to. She knew. And I knew she knew. Still, I had played my hand clean. I hadn't trespassed, hadn't directly caused the damage, hadn't even responded to any of her nonsense. All I'd done was hand her a gift that she accepted, used, and then let destroy her own backyard. And the more she flailed and pointed fingers, the worse she looked. Because while Karen was out there holding her own personal witch trial, the termites were still working. More neighbors began to report issues after attending Karen's event. A couple complained that their deck chairs, which had been lent out for one of her parties, now had strange grooves and hollow legs. Another neighbor noticed termites around the edges of their decorative planter boxes, which had been displayed right next to Karen's infested pergola. The buzz turned into concern, then into outrage. Because if there's one thing HOA members love more than authority, it's their property values. And now it wasn't just Karen's yard that was compromised, it was possibly spreading. Panic set in. An emergency HOA board meeting was called, and this time, everyone showed up. Not just the usual suspects who cared about mailbox paint and shrub placement. No, this was full turnout. People brought folding chairs, lemonade coolers, and some even brought popcorn like it was movie night. The meeting started with Harold clearing his throat and reading aloud a very formal agenda: termite infestation response, HOA structural liabilities, and leadership accountability. Karen tried to interrupt him within the first 2 minutes, but this time, no one let her take the floor. When she finally was allowed to speak, her voice was shaky and defensive. She talked about being targeted, about enemies of the HOA, about dark conspiracies. But it was all unraveling. Everyone could see it. That's when Janet stood up and brought out the big guns. She revealed that Karen had used discretionary HOA funds, money allocated for seasonal beautification and park maintenance, to rent tables, chairs, decorations, and catering for her own event. She even pulled up screenshots of the transactions, complete with Karen's digital signature. You could hear the collective inhale from the crowd. Karen's face turned a shade of red that made her pearls seem like they were glowing. "That was approved by the board," she shouted. "No, Karen," Janet replied calmly. "That was approved by you. The rest of us never even saw those forms." There was nothing she could say to that. Not when 3 separate board members nodded in agreement. And just like that, the tone shifted. No longer were people whispering or making side remarks. They were now openly angry. This was no longer about termites or woodpiles. It was about betrayal, abuse of power, the kind of thing that broke communities apart from the inside. Then came the motion. Harold stood back up and called for a vote of no confidence against Karen as HOA president. What followed was silence, then a single hand going up, then another, then dozens. Even people Karen considered allies looked away as they raised their hands. The final count wasn't even close. She had lost, and there was no recovery from it. Karen didn't leave with grace. She stood, screamed something about lawsuits, community memory, and how no one would maintain standards without her. But no one responded. She stormed off before the vote was even finalized. No one followed her. The new acting president, Janet, concluded the meeting by thanking everyone for attending and promising to begin real repairs, pest control coordination, and a full audit of how funds had been used over the past year. The crowd applauded, not in celebration, but in collective relief. The aftermath was almost poetic. Karen's once pristine backyard was now quarantined by pest control, the deck stripped down to its skeletal remains. The termite experts came in with hazmat suits and industrial equipment, and the sound of drills, vacuums, and buzz saws replaced the soft hum of party music that had once floated over her fence every other weekend. She stopped making appearances. Her husband started putting up tall privacy panels along the property line, like shielding themselves from the shame could somehow erase it. Neighbors began speaking more openly about her reign of entitlement. Stories emerged about fines she had imposed for invisible grass clippings, for leaving recycling bins visible for more than 12 minutes, for unapproved holiday decorations that were up on the wrong day. One woman said she was nearly fined for having a pink flamingo in her garden for her kid's birthday. Karen had called it visual pollution. Now, the community joked about installing a flamingo in Karen's yard, just out of spite. For my part, I remained quiet. I didn't parade my victory or poke the bear. I didn't need to. I had seen what happens when someone like Karen finally hits the wall. Her power had never come from rules. It came from fear. From the idea that she was untouchable. But once she was exposed, once people saw that she could fall, and fall hard, they stopped cowering. The house of cards had collapsed. And the termites were just the spark. Weeks later, I got a letter slipped under my door. No envelope, just a folded sheet of notebook paper. Inside, written in Karen's sharp, angry handwriting, was one sentence: "You think you've won, but this isn't over." I read it twice, chuckled, and tossed it in the fireplace. Because it was over. And deep down, she knew it. What remained of my original woodpile had been replaced. Frank dropped off a fresh, pest-free batch, his way of saying thanks for the best laugh he'd had in years. I stacked it neatly by my shed, this time with a tiny sign stuck on top. It read, "Not for HOA use or termites." Every neighbor who walked by saw it and smiled. A few even snapped pictures. Karen, if she saw it, never said a word. The neighborhood didn't just return to normal after her fall, it got better. People talked more, helped more. The new HOA board was transparent and fair. And for the first time in years, folks started enjoying their homes without worrying if some clipboard-wielding tyrant was about to issue a fine for mismatched patio furniture. Peace, it turns out, just needed a few bugs and the right kind of firewood. As the weeks rolled on and the echo of Karen's downfall settled into a quiet buzz, something strange started to happen. The neighborhood, once so tightly wound under her watchful gaze, began to breathe again. You could feel it in the way people started putting wind chimes back up without fear of citations. Children chalked the sidewalks without their parents nervously glancing over their shoulders. Garden gnomes made a triumphant return. Even Rick, the grumpy guy from the corner lot who once threatened legal action over a rogue sunflower, started waving at people. It was like the whole block had stepped out from under a dark cloud. And though no one said it out loud, everyone knew who'd blown that cloud away. Karen, meanwhile, had gone radio silent. No more flyers. No more HOA meetings. No more backyard jazz nights. She'd become a ghost in her own house. Her once busy backyard was a skeleton of its former self. No more pergola, no more fairy lights, no more smug laughter echoing over the fences. The termite extermination crew had done their job thoroughly, but they'd also stripped away half of her landscaping and declared a chunk of her deck unsalvageable. The insurance claim she filed apparently hit a few snags, too, given that her donated firewood hadn't exactly come from a store or documented supplier. Without official receipts or HOA approval, she had no proof that the damage was an accident, or even someone else's fault. She had built her castle on control, and now that the foundation had been eaten away, all that remained was the hollow frame of entitlement. But the real twist hadn't even happened yet. Came one afternoon when I was working in my garage. I was res-tacking the new wood Frank had delivered and organizing my tools when I heard a knock. Not at the front door, on the side gate. That was unusual enough that I paused, wiping my hands on a rag and stepping out cautiously. There stood Janet, clipboard in hand and a sheepish look on her face. "Hey," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if making sure no one else had followed her. "Got a minute?" I nodded and gestured toward the shade of the garage. She stepped in and lowered her voice. "Look," she began, "I know you've been quiet through all of this, which is honestly impressive, considering. But the board's been doing some digging, backtracking a few of Karen's decisions. We found something we thought you should see." She pulled a folder from her bag and handed it to me. Inside were printed emails, time-stamped notes, and digital records from HOA correspondence. One thread in particular stood out. It was from 6 months earlier, before the firewood incident, where Karen had emailed another board member suggesting that they should reappropriate unused community resources for upcoming HOA events. In the same thread, she referenced unregistered woodpiles and included a photo of mine, taken from a distance. My stomach turned. She'd been planning to take my woodpile long before that morning theft. It hadn't been a snap decision or a misunderstanding. It was premeditated, calculated, and documented. Janet must have seen my expression change because she added quickly, "We're not trying to stir things up again. But if you wanted to file a complaint, or even a civil claim, we'd back you." The HOA officially rescinded all actions she made without quorum approval, including anything tied to her events. Meaning, technically, what she did was theft. I didn't say anything right away. I just flipped through the rest of the folder. There were messages Karen had sent to vendors, calling herself the final authority on all HOA matters. Notes where she rejected budget proposals to fix sidewalks because she'd spent the funds on custom banners for her private parties. Even a receipt from a floral company addressed to her but charged to the HOA. It was worse than I thought. Not just a control freak, but a manipulator with a paper trail. I thanked Janet for bringing it to me. She nodded and said she hoped I'd consider my options, then left as quietly as she'd come. I stood in my garage for a long while after that, the folder still open in my hand. Part of me wanted to go full throttle. Take her to small claims court, demand restitution for the stolen wood, file formal charges for misappropriation. It would be poetic justice, and very, very satisfying. But then I thought about what had already happened. Karen had lost her power, her credibility, and her yard. The neighbors no longer feared her. The board no longer protected her. She'd become a cautionary tale. A punchline. A name people used to teach their kids about karma. Would dragging her through legal hell add anything to that? Or would it just turn me into the same kind of person she was, obsessed with control, unwilling to let go? So I let it be. I tucked the folder away in my filing cabinet, not as ammunition, but as a souvenir. Proof that, sometimes, doing nothing but letting the truth rise to the surface is enough. And as it turned out, I didn't need to lift a finger for the next wave of karma to hit. That weekend, a realtor's sign went up in Karen's front yard. It was discreet at first, but then came the photos online. The listing mentioned some structural work needed, and ongoing HOA revisions. Word got around that her husband had accepted a job out of state and they were relocating. Whether that was true or just a way for them to start over somewhere new didn't matter. What mattered was that they were leaving, packing up their kingdom and quietly slipping out the back door of the empire they once ruled. When the moving truck arrived, no one helped. A few people watched from windows. A couple even toasted quietly from their porches. I stood at my fence as they loaded the last of their things. Karen saw me. She didn't wave, didn't scowl, just looked, tired, small, and strangely human. For a second, I almost pitied her. Then I remembered the morning she stole from me and smirked like it was a joke. That pity vanished just as fast. The truck pulled away, and just like that, the Karen era was over. The neighborhood threw a casual block party a week later. Not to celebrate their departure, officially, but that's what it became. There were burgers, balloons, a bounce house someone finally felt comfortable renting again. I brought a batch of hickory-smoked ribs, made from the same kind of wood she once stole. People asked for the recipe. I told them it was aged with a little justice and a dash of poetic irony. Someone suggested we build a new community gazebo to replace the one Karen had monopolized. This time, it would be open to everyone. Voted on. Fair. The way it should have been from the beginning. I offered to donate some wood. Everyone laughed, including me. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the stars over a quiet neighborhood, I couldn't help but think of how close I'd come to escalating things too far. But nature had taken care of it better than I ever could. Sometimes revenge doesn't need fire and fury. Sometimes all it takes is a termite and a bad attitude. A few months after Karen and her husband drove off into what I assumed was the most uncomfortable U-Haul journey of their lives, peace had not only returned to the neighborhood, it had blossomed. The difference was striking. People began chatting at mailboxes again. Small favors returned, like neighbors helping neighbors carry groceries or mow lawns during vacation week. For the first time in years, there was a feeling of mutual respect. The HOA board meetings turned from battlegrounds into actual discussions, where people listened instead of barked. And Janet, now fully installed as the new HOA president, handled things with a level of calm professionalism no one realized they had been craving until it arrived. In Karen's absence, the whole community seemed to take a collective exhale. The infamous termite incident slowly faded into lore, the kind of story whispered about during cookouts and passed around with knowing chuckles. People knew, at least the ones who paid attention, that I'd had something to do with it. But they also understood why. Karen had ruled with an iron fist disguised as community pride, and when she finally got what was coming to her, it was almost too poetic to criticize. Still, I didn't go around bragging. I kept to my routine, chopped fresh wood for the coming winter, planted some climbing roses where her workers had trampled my beds, and went on with life. But that's when the second wave hit. The moment I realized Karen's legacy wasn't quite done unraveling. It started with a knock at the door one morning in early October. A man in a gray uniform stood there, badge on his chest and a leather binder tucked under one arm. He introduced himself as a representative from the county building inspector's office. Apparently, after Karen's deck and pergola implosion, her property had triggered a broader audit. The county wanted to make sure no other residences had unpermitted structures or illegal modifications. He handed me a checklist and asked if he could do a brief walkthrough of my backyard. I didn't mind, and I knew I had nothing to hide, but I was curious. I asked what prompted it specifically, and he replied, her complaint. She tried to claim she'd been sabotaged by unsafe adjacent properties, claimed your woodpile violated safety codes and may have contributed to the damage. I almost laughed. Even gone, Karen was still trying to shift the blame. I let the inspector do his walkthrough, showed him the new woodpile, properly stacked, stored on bricks, and far from any structures. He made a few notes, nodded in approval, and thanked me for my cooperation. Before he left, I asked him a final question. Did she really try to pin the whole thing on me? He paused, gave a tired smile, and said, let's just say she filed a lot of paperwork with a lot of people. You weren't the only neighbor she threw under the bus. Then he left. Later that day, I shared the encounter with Janet during a neighborhood cleanup event. She rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might stay stuck. She sent an anonymous letter to animal control about my dog, she muttered. Claimed it was a menacing breed. The dog's a corgi, for crying out loud. Another neighbor overheard and chimed in, revealing Karen had reported his garden gnome display as a potential gang symbol. The more we talked, the more it became clear that Karen hadn't just made enemies, she'd made a career of paranoid pettiness. Now her attempts at a scorched earth exit were catching up with her in small, embarrassing ways. But there was one last twist none of us expected. Around Halloween, the new family that had moved into Karen's old house hosted a pumpkin carving night. Nice people, young couple, 2 kids, very friendly. They invited the whole block, and it was the first time I'd set foot on that property since the termite storm. Everything had been redone, new deck, new landscaping, fresh paint, all clean and tasteful. As the kids bobbed for apples and the adults sipped cider, I found myself near the edge of the yard where Karen's infamous pergola had once stood. There, half buried in the soil, was a wooden sign. I brushed away the dirt and leaves. It was one of Karen's old custom-made HOA signs. Weathered but still legible. It read, HOA President reserves the right to appropriate community materials. Beneath it, scratched crudely in what looked like penknife etching, were the words, including your soul. I called a few people over, and we all stood there laughing until we nearly cried. One of the neighbors suggested we mount the sign on a piece of reclaimed wood and hang it in the new gazebo as a neighborhood relic. The idea caught on fast. Within a week, the sign was cleaned up and installed, officially labeled Exhibit A. A reminder that power should never be taken for granted. It became a photo spot, a talking point, and a quiet symbol of how far the neighborhood had come. And yet, the final moment of closure came on a quiet Sunday morning when I was trimming my hedges. A car pulled up to the edge of the cul-de-sac, unfamiliar, older model, tinted windows. It idled for a moment before a woman stepped out wearing large sunglasses and a scarf tied over her hair like she was avoiding paparazzi. Even from across the yard, I knew it was her. Karen stood there for a few minutes, staring at her old house, arms folded tightly. I wondered if she thought no one would notice her. She walked to the end of the driveway but didn't go up to the door. Instead, she just looked. Then she turned to leave. But before she got back in her car, she saw me. We locked eyes for just a second. There was no rage in her face. No smugness. Just that distant, hollow look of someone who no longer owned the narrative. She didn't wave. Neither did I. Then she got in and drove away. That was the last time I ever saw her. I walked back to my woodpile and split another log, the sound echoing into the stillness. There was nothing else to prove, nothing left to say. She had taken something from me, and I had given her something back, not with fists or threats, but with consequences. And in doing so, I had reminded her, and maybe even the whole neighborhood, that sometimes the strongest revenge is the one you don't have to explain. The kind that lets them dig their own pit, then hands them the shovel with a smile. The kind that ends, not with a shout, but with silence, and a backyard free of termites.